everyone to panel 4 today. There's a number of very interesting papers here to discuss today. I know that we have a number of people, a relatively high number of papers on this panel, so I won't bog us down by saying too much. But I'm looking forward to hearing about some of these interesting thoughts regarding candidates and parties and whatnot as it relates to electoral integrity and dispute resolution. So with that, I assume that we're just going to go in the order that is on the schedule, right? So we'll start with mechanically binding electorally hollow gender quotas in low magnitude districts. From Iris Acquarone and Gonzalo de Landro.
Hi, everyone. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
All right. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Gonzalo de Landro. I'm a postdoc at the University of Oxford, and I'm thrilled to be here presenting joint work with Iris Acquarone on gender quotas and electoral systems. So this is a paper about compliance with gender quota laws. We know very well that parties as overly masculinized institutions tend to oppose gender quotas in all stages of the policy process. When quotas are adopted, parties frequently comply in ways that preserve existing power relations, for instance, by reserving the most favorable districts to men, or simply through list engineering. So we know that compliance with gender quotas is adaptive to the electoral context. We also know that quotas work unevenly across electoral systems and institutional environments. We know that district magnitude matters and that quota threshold and design matters too. But the point we are trying to make in this paper is that we know relatively less about how magnitude and quota threshold, how district magnitude and quota threshold interact to shape compliance with gender quotas. But what is our point? If you think about it, district magnitude and quota thresholds are forces that pull in very different directions. So higher quota thresholds increase the pressure to nominate women, while lower magnitudes increase the value of each individual candidacy. So together, we believe that these conditions make quotas more binding. However, these same reasons make them electorally hollow, as parties may be incentivized to seek alternative ways to preserve male advantage. And in short, our main expectation here is that the combination of low district magnitudes and high thresholds generates the strongest incentives for strategic compliance with quotas in candidate nomination. Now, what's the problem here? Testing this argument is generally difficult because we rarely observe variation in quota thresholds across district magnitudes within the same country. However, Uruguay, which is the case we are studying, provides a useful exemption because the country implemented its first gender quota in 2014, and districts with magnitude greater than 2 faced a 30% quota threshold, while districts with magnitude of 2 faced a 50% quota threshold. So this design creates meaningful variation in how binding the quota is. And throughout this presentation, I will refer to these magnitude 2 districts with 50% threshold as the treated group, which is in red in this map, and the remaining districts as the control group. So again, this map shows these districts in 2014, and all I'm gonna do in the next slides is comparing outcomes of women representation in these two groups of districts pre and post quota. So to do this, we assembled an original data set with information on all legislative candidates in Uruguay from 1989 to 2014. This includes information on their sex, their party, and faction. Here, we are focusing on 4 elections within this period because we are still finalizing the data collection for some new data sources for the latest elections. Data is in digital format for the oldest election. It comes in scanned PDFs or images that we have to process through OCR. So it's a process that takes time, but we're very excited doing it. So our unit of analysis here is the party list. And something that I have to understand is that because parties in Uruguay are very fractionalized, each party typically presents several lists within the same district, one for each faction. The outcomes that we're going to pay attention to are three. First is the share of women in candidate lists. Second is whether a list is female-led. And third is whether there's a woman among the top two positions in the party list. And what we're going to do to estimate these effects is using an event study model. Basically, each coefficient here captures the difference between treated and controlled districts in a given election year, relative to the baseline year, which is 2009, which is the last election before the quota reform. We're also going to include and specify district and election fixed effects, which accounts for unobserved factors that are constant across district or across elections. And importantly, and I'm sorry because I'm expanding a bit on Uruguayan jargon, but this is important for me to explain because it's going to speak about the outcomes. We're going to search for heterogeneous treatment effects across another institution, which is the type of substitutes that each list uses. So in Uruguay, for every main candidate, there is 3 substitutes who take the seat if the main candidate leaves office. So this is an example of 2 lists from the same party in the same magnitude 2 district before the quota reform, which each list, one from the top and the bottom, corresponding to a different faction. So parties can organize their substitutes in 2 ways. Under the respective substitution system, which is the one from the top, each main candidate is linked to their own 3 substitutes, which preserves a clear distinction between main candidates and substitutes. So after the quota, one of the 2 main candidates in red in the image from the top must be a woman, right? Under the preferential system, which is the one from the bottom, main candidates and substitutes are drawn from the same order pool. So this gives parties much greater flexibility to place women down the list while still complying to the 50% quota requirement. So we're going to test this by estimating a heterogeneous treatment effects based on the substitution system used by each party faction. Now, moving to the results, these density plots gives us a first look of the data. And as you can see, both groups of districts, the treatment and control, increase the share of women candidates after the quota reform. That's the panel from the right, but only up to the respective quota threshold. The control group clusters around 30%, while the treated group clusters around 50%, which suggests minimal compliance in both cases. But which is the interesting thing here is that the treated group here in red also displays a second mode at 0, which reflects a persistent mass of all male lists. This is a very curious pattern that already suggests that parties either comply minimally with the rule or did not comply at all, a pattern that I'm going to show you in the next few slides. So the event study results, right, they show limited evidence that the reform increased the overall share of women candidates in treated districts, right? This is the first panel. On the middle panel, we also do not observe meaningful changes in the prevalence of female-led lists. The main shift here occurs in the third panel, which is in green, which is the probability that a woman appears among the top 2 candidates, which increased. So this suggests that parties adjusted to satisfy the quota requirement, but broader nomination patterns changed much less. And on its own, these results suggest formal compliance, but it really does not explain how parties adapted their nomination strategies. So to understand that, we have to shift to the heterogeneous effects analysis. And I think that these slides contain what I believe is the key result of the paper, right? So when lists operate under the respective substitution system, here in green, the treatment increases the share of women candidates by roughly 18 percentage points. Under the preferential system, which is the one from the right on red, the estimated effect is negative and about 10 percentage points. So what does it mean? The same quota reform appears to produce very different outcomes depending on the institutional environment in which parties operate. In other words, when quotas become more binding, the crucial question is whether parties have alternative pathways available to preserve this male advantage. So what I've just shown you is, using this case of Uruguay, the 2014 quota reform, is that a low district magnitude combined with a high quota threshold did not lead to the nomination of women relative to larger districts with lower threshold. So what did parties do? They adapted their nomination strategy. In larger districts, women were often placed in lower positions in the list. In magnitude 2 districts, parties placed women in the second position when required, but where substitution rules provide greater flexibility, they moved women further down the list. Right? So this heterogeneous effect suggests that the institutional opportunities for adaptation were central in shaping the impact of the reform. And just thinking about broader implications of this, right? We believe that there are two. The first is that, well, overall, the effectiveness of quotas depend not only on the quota rule itself, but also on the institutional configuration that surrounds it. So we believe that this suggests two recommendations for policymakers or quota advocates. First, when we think about quota reforms, either expanding quotas or designing quotas for the first time, we should think about how quotas speak to the broader institutional context in place in this country, right? We have to anticipate how the quotas are going to interact with other institutions. Second, we believe that reform, especially for quota advocates, reform efforts should also target the institutions that give parties more flexibility, right? In this case, the substitution system. All in all, we believe that improving the effectiveness of quotas requires changing not only the quota, but also the institutions that shape parties' incentives to comply with them. And with that, I turn it up to you. Thank you, and I look forward for your questions.
Great. Thank you, Gonzalo, that you nailed it timing-wise. So as we continue to move forward, the next paper on the list is Can't Afford to Lose, Parliamentary Election Spending and Acceptance of Election Defeat from Nicholas Kerr and Michael Wahman.
All right. Well, thanks again to the EIP crowd and to Joseph and Bernard for taking time to engage with our work. I'm going to present this paper called Can't Afford to Lose. This is co-authored work with Nicholas Kerr, who's going to be presenting his own paper right after me. And although I think most of you would prefer to listen to a Jamaican accent over a Swedish one, you'll just have to do with me for now. So this is a project that Nicholas and I have been talking about for a while. And it stems out of this literature on public perceptions of election quality, of electoral integrity. But we wanted to focus in this paper on not public perceptions, but the perceptions of candidates themselves. So this is a story from Malawi, for instance, in northern Malawi in Mzuzu, where a losing candidate blamed his loss on insufficient electoral quality. Whereas this was the story that was promoted by the losing candidate. The winning candidate said that really this kind of inability to accept defeat is just basically a reflection on the loser being a sore loser. And we know that this matters greatly because the literature on public perceptions of election quality has increasingly started to focus on elite signaling. Indeed, we had the story about the US election previously, where it seems quite possible that the great level of skepticism against the quality of that election stems from the losing candidate's inability to accept defeat. So it seems important to look not only at voters' perceptions of election quality, but also candidates. We can't assume that the same factors will explain voter satisfaction as candidate satisfaction, because of course candidates are players in this game themselves, and they have certain strategic interests that are going to be different than those of voters. If there's one thing that has really emerged from this literature on public perceptions of election quality is that there's this persistent winner-loser gap, where winners tend to be much more favorably disposed towards election quality than losers. That's maybe not too surprising. And this is also what has been shown in the very small literature on candidates' perception of election quality. But we argue that the more interesting question, of course, is to explain the variation in losers' evaluation of electoral quality. And we argue that if we think about voters, voters are very interested in prospective costs. So an emerging literature has talked about polarization and how polarization might be quite bad for public trust in elections, because if you lose, you project larger costs in the future, if those are economic or social costs. But candidates are different in that candidates have most of their costs actually appearing before the election as what we refer to as sunk costs. They spend significant resources in trying to be elected, and when they lose, of course, they have already these costs have already occurred for the candidates, and that can be really devastating for their ability to endorse the election as free and fair. We think that these sunk costs are really important as an explanatory variable for why some losers are better at accepting defeat or acknowledging electoral freeness and fairness than others. High sunk costs, of course, leads to high psychological barriers to accept defeat. If you've spent a lot of your own resources in a campaign, it might be psychologically harder to accept that despite all these resources, voters did not want you as their representative. But more than that, it's also strategically important, because if you have spent all those resources in an election campaign, a lot of those resources come from other sources, financial backers, supporters, and others. And despite all those resources, you did not manage to win an election. That could really make it hard to motivate further investment in your campaign going forward. This could be quite different from someone who has lower sunk costs. In fact, in some cases, if you have very low sunk costs, it could actually be potentially risky to undermine the trust in elections. If you do so, it might be harder to motivate potential backers to back you in the future. Instead, you could use the electoral loss as a motivation for further and future investments in your campaign. So the hypothesis that we are trying in this paper is that higher campaign spending is associated with lower election quality evaluation among losing parliamentary candidates. We focus on 3 different African elections in this paper: Malawi 2019, Nigeria 2019, and Zambia 2021. These are 3 African cases, but we do think that the results from this paper will have high relevance also outside of the African continent, particularly if we think about other cases where we have lacking generalized trust in elections. So you don't have a general consensus that elections are free and fair, and where there's also high electoral spending. And this is particularly true in single member district elections, as all of these 3 are. So the reason that we started working on this project was that Nicholas had been working in Nigeria on a candidate survey there, and I had done similar candidate surveys in Malawi and Zambia. So we pooled all our data, and with our pooled data, we have a unique candidate survey of 792 candidates across these 3 elections. 695 of those were losing candidates. In our data set, we have data on campaign spending. So we have self-reported how much did you spend in a campaign. In our models, we're going to standardize the campaign spending because there are quite significant variations across the countries in how costly campaigns are. And then we also have data on evaluation of constituency election quality. So we asked candidates how free and fair they thought that the election in their constituency was. So I will just quickly show you some of the main results from our paper. So first, importantly, we see a quite big difference between winners and losers in how they evaluate elections. Maybe not so surprising. This is true in all 3 of our countries. But also more interestingly, we find that in all these 3 countries, high spending candidates evaluate high spending losing candidates evaluate elections as less free and fair than low spending ones. The difference is bigger in some countries than others. So this is particularly pronounced in Malawi and less pronounced in Nigeria. But in all three countries, we find this relationship. In the paper, we modeled the relationship between the two. I'm not going to show you the full regression models. In the models, we use country fixed effects. We also control for important confounding variables like gender, whether you represented the political party that won the election. And then we interact winner and loser status with how much you spent using this sort of standardized spending measure. And what we find is that among losers, the more you spend, the less likely you are to say that the election was free and fair. The opposite is true for those candidates who won their elections. And the relationship is statistically significant and substantial in our pooled models. And we also find this to be the case across all the three countries, although the level of significance varies somewhat between the three. So we think that this paper has some rather important consequences, both in terms of theory development and also in terms of policy implications. What we show here is that loss is not binary. Some candidates, they lose more than others, and you lose more if you have incurred a lot of sunk costs in an election, and this is really going to matter in how you evaluate elections. Securing losers' acceptance of election laws is really crucial for democratic deepening. So really, the consequence of this paper is that one of the things that need to be done in order to enhance public legitimacy and candidate legitimacy of elections is to think about how money-fueled politics really erode the possibility for losers to endorse elections after they lose. And this is one further adverse consequence of money-fueled politics. There's been significant research on how high campaign spending is detrimental for the election of women and equal political representation, how it spurs corruption. But what we show here is that can actually really also undermine the legitimacy of elections. So I will wrap up there, and thank you so much, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you as well for, once again being very mindful of your time. We're really trucking along here. So the next paper that we're going to go for here is post-election dispute resolution in Malawi, assessing parliamentary candidates' experiences and the consequences for democratic legitimacy, from Nicholas Kerr and Karen Konda.
Michael, thanks so much for the presentation of that paper. I always want to start off by just telling Holly and Toby thanks for their leadership of the Electoral Integrity Project. I looked back and realized it's 13 years since I gave my first presentation here at the Electoral Integrity Project, right? And it's still going, so that's fantastic. All right, so today's talk is entitled Political Elites and Democratic Legitimacy. And this is a paper that is brand new, really, just written. And I want to thank Karen Konda, who is a co-author on this paper, for working along with me in terms of the ideas on this paper. And I know she's in the audience listening. All right, so this paper really is trying to broaden our understanding of the ways in which a dispute resolution, and especially post-election dispute resolution institutions, how they impact democratic legitimacy. And one of the things that we realized with these post-dispute resolution institutions is that across Africa, we are seeing a lot of trends with regard to the ways in which losing candidates have been responding to loss. One is that there's been an increasing number of candidates at the presidential level and the parliamentary level who have been challenging electoral results. And they've been using various ways of doing it. But what is very encouraging is the ways in which they've been relying on formal dispute resolution institutions to be able to do so. And here I'm just using an example from the latest 2025 elections in Malawi, where a major opposition candidate is challenging an MP who's also a minister of parliament. And the newspaper headlines are really highlighting the different stages of this challenge as it goes through the courts. But what we know as scholars is that democratic legitimacy, regardless of whether or not we are in new emerging democratic contexts or established democracies, that it depends a lot on losers' ability to accept electoral outcomes. And we see these emergence of these post-election dispute resolution institutions really as an institutional innovation that allows losers who may be disgruntled to give them the ability to facilitate the type of acceptance that is needed through peaceful means. And so far, there's been a growing literature looking at electoral dispute resolution. And so right now, we know something about why candidates may be challenging elections. We know something about why and how dispute resolution institutions are designed and how they might be reformed over time. But we know very little about how candidates are experiencing those institutions. And so the main research question that Karen and I are posing within this paper is trying to understand how parliamentary candidates and how their experiences with these post-election dispute resolution institutions, how they might be influencing democratic legitimacy. Now, we put forward a very simple theory that says that the ways in which election dispute resolution institutions matter is not simply by the ways in which they're designed, not by ways in whether or not candidates have access to these institutions, but also because based on the types of experiences that they have during their engagement with these institutions. We recognize that institutional experience is just one, but several ways in which especially political elites can find out information about how these institutions perform, including the authorities that are responsible for these institutions, the procedures that are followed, the processes, as well as the outcome. But direct engagement with these institutions matter, and they're going to have an influence on democratic legitimacy and future political participation. In the paper, what we do is identify 4 expectations that we believe are going to be associated with the experience and engagement with these institutions. And again, these are very preliminary because we're very early in this stage of the research. The first one deals with beliefs, this idea that candidates are forming beliefs about the institutional function, and these beliefs are somewhat stable over time. Another very important one is that the level of trust and the ways in which institutional experience may influence trust is specific to the specific institution that elites are engaged in. We are using the example of Malawi that has a dual track post-election dispute resolution system. And so one of the things we argue is that a lot of times the ways in which candidates or elites attitudes, that candidate attitudes are going to be specific to the institutions that they engage in. But we also recognize that there may be some broader legitimacy impact, but we would expect that to be much less and these attitudes to be much less responsive when compared to institutional trust. Finally, one of the things we argue, which may be somewhat counterintuitive, that those individuals and elites who engage with these institutions are going to also be more likely to participate in democratic forms of engagement in the future. And I can go into more about that in the Q&A. So we're looking at the case of Malawi, and we feel that Malawi is an ideal case to be thinking about post-election dispute resolution, primarily because they have this very unique system of a dual-track dispute resolution, which starts out with an administrative track through the Malawi Electoral Commission, which forms its main electoral management body, as well as a judicial track through the High Court. It's also, an electoral democracy. Michael and I will probably go back and forth with regard to how high, the level of democracy and the quality of elections. But compared to several other countries, definitely more stable and exists a higher level of democracy, even within the African context. There's a very important event that takes place in 2019 that really provides a focal point for the understanding of election dispute resolution, where in Malawi, the court annuls a presidential election result and orders a rerun on the basis of procedural irregularities. And the losing candidate in the first round of those elections runs and actually wins in that rerun. And it provides a basis for us to understand changes in norms around the role of this judicial track. So here is an image that just shows the post-election dispute resolution system in Malawi. And as I emphasize, there are these dual tracks. I want to emphasize also that this administrative track occurs where political candidates can register complaints or file complaints with the Malawi Electoral Commission anytime up until the point in which all the results for that parliamentary election have been certified. And the judicial track exists throughout the electoral period and also after results are certified. There's one more level where results can be appealed at the Supreme Court. And so because of this, Malawi is really unique in terms of its level of adjudication, as well as these dual tracks, probably comparable to about 30% of countries around the world. What we were able to do is Michael and his team were gracious enough to allow me to become a Malawi expert for the 2025 elections. And so we pooled resources and we were able to run a second wave of his survey that he started in 2019. This survey included 280 candidates who ran in the 2025 elections. And the survey includes several indicators of legitimacy, including trust in the Malawi Electoral Commission, trust in the High Court that's responsible for the judicial track, satisfaction with democracy, so we can get a few democratic attitudes, and intention to participate in the 2030 elections. With regard to the experience indicators, which are our main independent variables, we have one that looks at whether or not a candidate files a complaint through the administrative track. We also look at the process and the outcome, right? And one of the things we find in the procedural justice literature is that outcomes may be as important as the type of process that candidates experience. And then we look at whether or not candidates file a judicial petition. I know I probably have about 3 minutes left, so let me get through some of the descriptive results and share some of the main findings. So based on our survey of 280 candidates, 36 candidates in the sample reported filing a complaint with the Malawi Electoral Commission. And very importantly, we find that 80% of these complaints were not investigated based on the candidate data that we had. 7 were investigated, and of those, the 7 within our sample, 3 were ruled favorably, and then another 4 got unfavorable rulings. So then what we try to do is to estimate the impact of actually filing a petition on our 4 outcomes with regard to democratic legitimacy. And I'm not going to present the regression results or the coefficients, but what we find is that an individual, a candidate who files a complaint, reports lower levels of trust in the Malawi Electoral Commission, but also reports higher intentions to participate in the 2030, in the next parliamentary elections. No impact on trust in the High Court and no impact on democratic satisfaction. The second thing we looked at, and here I'm looking at the responsiveness of the Malawi Electoral Commission, trying to look at the types, the quality of the process that candidates experience, those who filed. What we find is that those whose complaints were not investigated had lower levels of trust in the Malawi Electoral Commission. The 2 other outcomes, because the sample size is so small, we see that the confidence intervals are quite high, but we get this sense that an unfavorable outcome is somewhat lower in terms of lowering levels of trust compared to individuals who have no complaints. Let me just go quickly to the judicial track. So again, this occurs after elections have been, results have been announced. And in the data, we have 24 candidates who failed to accept or rejected or challenged the electoral outcomes. And 12 of them, or 50%, filed petitions in the High Court. And so the question we want to know is, does the act of filing a petition compare to not filing a petition, or failing to accept the election results and not actually filing a petition? Does that matter for legitimacy? And here we find that this has no impact on trust in the Malawi Electoral Commission. It has no impact on trust in the High Court. But those who file their electoral petitions are more likely to report higher levels of democratic satisfaction, right? This is an association. We can't really prove any causal relationship. And they're more likely to report that they will contest the next election. Here I'm just showing some predicted margins of the intent to recontest. And what we find is that those who accepted the results, are somewhat less likely to want to recontest when compared to those 12 candidates who didn't accept the results but petitioned, and this all the way on the right side of the figure. So I'll just wrap up by just talking about some of the main findings. Institutional experiences with these post-election dispute resolution institutions matter, but the effects are somewhat selective. We see direct effects with regard to this complaint process with the Malawi Electoral Commission on trust, lowering trust. It seems also that for those who didn't get their complaint investigated, they were very critical of the Malawi Electoral Commission, and this is somewhat rational. But we don't find any impact on trust in the High Court. And we also ran a battery of indicators of a test on various indicators on judicial legitimacy as well. No impact on that. But the counterintuitive finding really, if for those of us who think about electoral participation in the context of new and emerging democratic context, that these experiences seem to boost, intentions to participate in the democratic process, especially in the future. And I think there are some very important contributions that this paper can make, and I'll be interested to hear what you think. But that institutional experiences are, an understudy mechanism linking post-election dispute resolution to democratic legitimacy. And from a policy perspective, for those, policymakers, and experts, election experts within the room, that in these dual track systems, which represent probably about 30% of the systems that exist around the world, the dilemma that electoral management bodies are in, that, about how they should be investing their capacity in terms of complaint handling or core administrative tasks. Really happy to hear your feedback on the paper, and thanks, Karen and I are thankful for the comment. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Nicholas. And with that, we will move on to our last paper, Politicians and Electoral Management in Canada, from Valere Gaspard.
Perfect. Thank you, Joseph. So my name is Valere Gaspard, and my project today is on Canadian politicians' assessments of electoral management. This is part of my thesis work at the University of Ottawa as a PhD candidate. So to start off, my presentation will proceed in 5 parts. So I'll start with the context and the research questions, my theoretical framework and hypotheses, the methodology, the main findings, and then of course we'll go into the discussions and questions afterwards. So just for some starting context, this paper assumes that there are 3 actors that are needed for a competitive election. So not necessarily a free and fair election, but just to have the minimum criteria of having an election. You need citizens to vote, politicians to run as candidates, and actors to administer the election, so usually like an electoral management body, an EMB. And previous research shows that the performance of EMBs and the design of EMBs, such as their independence, matter for electoral processes and matter for how the election occurs. However, and this is the gap in literature that I'm trying to address, is we know little about politicians' evaluations of electoral processes. So some of the papers today were looking at winners or losers, or about how politicians look at the electoral process, but as they noted, there's not a lot of work on this. And there's also not a lot of work on politicians' evaluations of EMB design, EMB performance, or what factors might influence these evaluations. So you might be thinking to yourself, Valere, why should we care about politicians' evaluations of the electoral process? And there's really 3 main reasons from my perspective. So 1, politicians engage with electoral management bodies throughout the electoral process and in several ways, whether it's them or their team. Politicians are central actors in elections and can have a great influence on public opinion, especially public opinion relating to the freeness and fairness of elections. And third, if politicians are elected, they can modify election laws or institutional processes, so their opinions could have tangible impacts on how elections work in the future. So with this in mind, I asked 2 research questions. The first one is, which factors influence politicians' satisfaction with the EMB administering the election and their perceptions of electoral integrity? And the second one is a Canadian-specific question. Do Canadian politicians prefer having an EMB that is more or less independent from the government? And if so, how do they weigh the different dimensions of EMB independence? So my theoretical framework and hypotheses proceed in 2 parts. In the first part, I look at the individual characteristics of politicians and see whether winning or losing, their own populist attitudes, or their own perceptions of foreign interference have an effect on their satisfaction with the electoral management body or their perceptions of electoral integrity. In a second part, I take their perceptions of electoral integrity and their satisfaction with the EMB to create an index of their overall perception of the electoral process and see if these overall perceptions influence their EMB independence preferences. So I'll get into what these preferences are a bit later into the presentation. So in the first part, I look at 3 variables, and the first characteristic that I look at is winning or losing at both the individual or the party level. So overall, I expect that Canadian politicians who lost the election will be less satisfied with the EMB and have more negative perceptions of electoral integrity, while those who won will be more satisfied and have more positive perceptions of electoral integrity. The rationale here is that people who lost will have more negative views of the campaign, which translates into their evaluations of the process. And also past research in Germany has shown that politicians who lost have more negative views of electoral integrity. So I expect this to translate into the Canadian context as well. When it comes to populist attitudes, it's a very similar rationale. Essentially, politicians with stronger populist attitudes will be less satisfied with the EMB and have more negative perceptions of electoral integrity, whereas those with weaker populist attitudes will have more positive perceptions and more positive evaluations. So the rationale here is that populists in general are less trusting of institutions, and having populist attitudes is often a predictor of distrust in political institutions. And populist citizens are more likely to mistrust elections, so it's expected that this should translate into politicians as well. And also, past research in Germany has shown that populist candidates do have more negative perceptions of electoral integrity. So this is likely to translate over into the Canadian case as well, or at least there's no reason for us to think why this wouldn't. The last set of expectations for their individual characteristics is about foreign interference. So very similar rationale where it's if they believe foreign interference affected the election, then they'll be less satisfied with the EMB and have more negative perceptions of electoral integrity. Whereas if they think foreign interference did not affect the election, they'll have more positive perceptions. So the rationale here is that foreign interference threatens the freeness of elections. So if a politician believes that foreign interference happened, then they will believe that it affected the freeness of the election. They also might think that foreign interference might attempt to disadvantage or advantage certain actors. So if they believe that it occurred, then they'll think that certain actors were either put at an advantage or at a disadvantage. And furthermore, even the perception of foreign interference can influence the public's opinion of the credibility of the election, even if it doesn't affect the actual administration. This is why I look at perceptions of foreign interference rather than quantifiable foreign interference. So even if it didn't happen in Canada, it's about whether politicians believe that it happened. Moving on to part 2 of the analysis, this is where I look at Canadian politicians' EMB independence preferences. So there are 4 dimensions of an EMB's independence that I examine. I look at the institutional dimension, which is about the electoral management body's relationship with the executive branch of government. The second one, which is personnel, and that's how is the EMB's staff and highest position appointed or removed. Financial independence, which is about how the budget is determined. And then functional independence, which is about the competencies and powers of the EMB. And in this case, I look at how ballots are counted and who decides, who has final say over whether a ballot counts or doesn't count. So the rationales here for why I think Canadian politicians will prefer more independent dimensions is because that would be consistent with the current practices in Canada, and more independence likely contributes to the country's well-administered elections to begin with. However, if a politician was in a different country, it might be expected that they prefer their own model of EMB. So let's say a politician in a governmental model might prefer a governmental EMB, whereas because Canadians are in an agency model, which is more independent, they probably prefer an independent model. The second part of this hypothesis is that Canadian politicians who are dissatisfied with the electoral process will prefer a less independent EMB. The main rationales here is that if they are dissatisfied with the process, they might prefer to diverge from current practices because they think that an alternative could be better. And this is why I would say that a dissatisfied politician in another country with, let's say, a governmental model of EMB might also wish to change their country's practices. So it's not about the agency model per se, and more about them wanting to change what is the norm in their country if they are dissatisfied. So with that in mind, I'll quickly go over the methodology just to be conscious of time. But the survey was 328 Canadian politicians, and the analysis was weighed to ensure that both winners and losers were accommodated, and also politicians from different political parties. And if people have questions about the variables or the conjoint experiment, I would be happy to return to that, but I'll just skim over it just for the sake of time. But in short, when I ran the conjoint study, politicians were given the option to select either Electoral Management Body A or Electoral Management Body B. And the characteristics of each electoral management body were randomized based on the 4 dimensions of EMB independence. So in short, it was a good experiment to determine what kind of EMB politicians would prefer, but it also gave them the opportunity to weigh pros and cons based on the different dimensions, and to really weigh their own preferences, because they were asked the question 4 times and each time it was randomized. So they were able to really determine or to really try and they were given the chance to really try and prioritize which preference they might or which dimension they might prefer the most, or to kind of have to make trade-offs. So when it comes to the main findings, I'm going to break it down first with their satisfaction with Elections Canada, and then their perceptions of electoral integrity. So the key findings here are that while all the variables were significant in an initial model, once all the variables were considered, so controls and the other independent variables, only perceptions of foreign interference remained significant. So basically, winning and losing was not significant once all the variables were considered, and populist attitudes were not significant once all the variables are considered. This is likely because the perception of foreign interference effect was so strong that the other ones, that the other two variables became non-significant, and that this effect and that perception of foreign interference was just overall stronger in terms of Canadian politicians, and there was more variability in their responses. So just to see how perceptions of foreign interference affected their satisfaction with Elections Canada. In short, while most politicians in Canada have a somewhat high or very high evaluation of the EMB, their perception of foreign interference can still affect it. So if a politician believed that the election was not at all affected by foreign interference, they would have just above a 3.4 out of 4 in terms of their satisfaction of Elections Canada. Whereas if they believed it was very affected, it would go almost below 3. So it does show that even though Canadian politicians generally have positive views of the election, perception of foreign interference does have a significant effect on their own views. Very similar findings for perceptions of electoral integrity, winning or losing, and populist attitudes once the other variables were considered were not significant, whereas perceptions of foreign interference was significant even when everything was considered. To go to the graph, the effect of perceptions of foreign interference on electoral integrity was even stronger than satisfaction of the EMB. So as you'll see, if a politician believed that foreign interference did not at all affect the election, they would be at about a 9.2 out of 10. So this is on a 0 to 10 scale. Whereas if they believe foreign interference affected the election, they would be right below a 7, which is a 2-point drop. And in a country with very strong perceptions of electoral integrity in general amongst both politicians and citizens, this is quite a stark finding, I would say. So even in a country like Canada, where things are known to be above board, perceptions of foreign interference can really change these perceptions amongst candidates. When it comes to their EMB independence preferences, just to quickly say, the Canadian politicians don't always prefer more independence. They do prefer more independence for institutional, personnel, and financial independence. But when it comes to functional independence, they actually prefer a less independent version of an electoral management body. Basically, they would rather that candidates or candidates' representatives have the final say over whether a ballot is counted, rather than the agency or the EMB having final say over whether a ballot is counted. So you can see that here where the non-agency selection probability is higher for functional, whereas in all the other cases, the agency model is higher. As the final finding, when it comes to Canadian politicians who are dissatisfied with the electoral process will prefer a less independent EMB. This is somewhat confirmed, but it's a weak effect. So when it comes to functional independence, which is when they prefer a less independent model, dissatisfied politicians are much more likely to select the non-agency model. But if you are a very satisfied politician with the electoral process, you might be just as likely to select the agency model, even though in general they are more likely to select the non-agency model for functional independence. So that's illustrated here, where when it comes to functional independence, as you become more satisfied with the process, you become as likely to select either an agency or non-agency model. Thank you, everyone, for your time, and I look forward to your questions and the discussion later on. Thank you.
Great. Thanks to everyone who's presented. I believe that we are now through all of our papers for today. So we can move to the discussion. And
Joseph, why don't I just jump in and do the first 3? And And thank you, by the way, Joseph graciously volunteered to cover a number of the papers as well. So we're splitting up the work a little bit. But I'll try to keep, so should I just go ahead?
Yeah,
Uh,
please.
I I will try to keep it brief, mostly so that there's more time for further discussion. Thank you all for giving me the opportunity to read these papers. That was it's elections and electoral systems is my area, but the specifics that you've discussed aren't always exactly what I do. And so there's an opportunity to learn a little bit or learn a lot. I don't necessarily, if I, I'm sure I will get details wrong as we're going through this, but I'll do the best that I can to give something that's a contribution to everybody involved. I'm going to change the order around a little bit of the ones I'm looking at. I think I'm going to start with Iris and Gonzalo's paper on the gender quotas and district magnitude, which is it would very. This is a solid paper. I'm just going to start with that. This is a paper that has looks like it's polished, looks like it's pretty close to ready to go and be submitted somewhere. And just to go over it really briefly again, just to rehash as well as I can. That's basically the argument is that there are some people that argue that low district magnitude is actually improves the functioning of gender quotas in terms of candidate selections when the government specifies, okay, you need a certain percentage of women, and here are the specifics, that you lower the magnitude, that improves the process. And the authors are arguing a kind of the opposite based on their findings. And they went and tested this in Uruguay, and in terms of an election law that had changed, I think it would have been 2014, and to see, okay, how does this work? Now, this is the things that I like about it, among other things, is well, part of it is they're developing an original data set, which we all know is extremely time consuming, but it's also the kind of a two-way fixed effects. And I don't see many difference in different designs. I always like seeing these. So this is a very well polished analysis. And specifically, it's doing a comparison of if you have a district magnitude of 2 compared to when the magnitudes are larger. And without being able to go into detail or rehash it, what it basically is arguing is that district magnitude of 2 is what will happen is the parties will pretend to be, they will follow the law, but it will not have a particular effect. And the reason is because they always put the woman on spot number 2 on the party list. Since there's only 2 seats, it's usually divided between the political parties. And so this becomes the finding. So here, the findings specific to the case, to me at least, were completely convincing. I will just give 2 comments, and I'm not sure it's something that you want to address immediately or think about later. And the argument is lower district magnitude can actually hurt the gender quotas. But looking at the results, I do have to wonder, okay, is it specifically M equals 2 is what causes the problem? When does it get better? It's not a linear relationship, or at least it's not shown that way. Once you increase the numbers, is it possible that, to let's say 3 or 4, that this effect still happens? So this is something to consider. The paper, this is always the problem we have. We're dealing with, we want to be very exact, but at the same time, we want to be clear. The presentation is very clear. The writing is clear, but it is at points, technical. So that's also something maybe you should, see, want to take a look at. The last one I'm going to be talking about is Valere's about about candidate views on election management. So this is clearly a developing project based on survey results. It's a survey result. There's a conjoint experiment, and it's really going into the question of how people react. And we all know why, this is an important issue, whether, how politicians react to EMDs or EMBs. And the main findings are that who are the ones who are most likely to have negative views, and they would be candidates who lose, which is not surprising, populists, which is not surprising, but those who believe that there was foreign interference. So these kind of is where it comes down to three. Now, I can tell you where my reaction would be, let's say, if I was a reviewer and looking at this closely, and this is something that I think needs to be explored more. Why the foreign interference? Was there some, I'm not an expert in Canadian politics, was there some sort of serious foreign interference issue? Was it something real, or was it something some people imagined? Who would imagine these things? Well, it would be the populists. And so the question becomes, are you actually finding stuff on thoughts on foreign interference, or is there something going on underneath? Now, candidates, you only have so many cases, it's 200 some cases, totally understandable. But what I noticed looking at the regressions is that right-wing conspiracy theory works on a model that doesn't include the foreign interference question. The second you put both of them into the model, the populist variable falls out, becomes insignificant. Could be multicollinearity. And so I think what you need to do, I would do certainly before moving forward, is to kind of jump in and try to kind of hash that out, at least test it, run some VIF tests or something. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Joseph. Let me hand it on over to him.
Great. Thank you, Bernard, for taking those like first three papers. I'll go through some of my general thoughts on the two papers dealing with dispute resolution, as this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. As this is why I volunteered to talk about them, is that this is sort of what I read about. I also want to, following Nicholas's lead, thank Holly and Toby for doing so much organization related to this. Everyone else involved with the Electoral Integrity Project. I think that like Nicholas, we met probably about 13 years ago, and I think it was at the conference in Alexandria, maybe, and we like talked about this some of this like post-election dispute resolution stuff. So it's really, I appreciate that you're still working on it. I teach your paper, another paper of yours with Michael Wahman, the 2021 comparative politics paper, in a number of my courses here. So in any case, like turning to the Can't Afford to Lose paper, I thought that this was really interesting, right? In that this paper, as well as the other paper, does fill a legitimate sort of void in the literature as it relates to like specifically thinking about and specifically asking candidates about how they interact with this process. And so to that end, I think that it's like, again, very interesting and a like extremely like worthwhile project. From a framing perspective with this paper, and I do think that this came through a little bit more in the presentation, right, was the it is essentially like differentiating this from sort of the standard story about motivated reasoning as it relates to electoral integrity from people that simply lost an election, right? And so that's sort of like one sort of like big thing. We'll talk about this more in a second when I talk about the results. Another thing that I thought could be a little more like fleshed out in the paper is the motivation for the case selection, right? In that on the one hand, it's like it feels like it would be beneficial to commit to is a more theoretically like motivated, like essentially like, are you trying to do more or less a most similar case design, right, or a most different case design? In that you talk both about in some cases that or in you know, like various points in the paper, right? Um, there's the like strengths of how similar these cases are, and in some cases how different they are. And it's as it relates to the propensity for people engaging with like electoral integrity or evaluating electoral integrity, it makes sense to potentially commit to sort of like one or the other of these like various approaches. Also on the fourth page, right, you say that clearly, quote, like clearly elites have no incentive to undermine the credibility of an election they lost. It's not clear to me whether this is potentially just a typo, in which case you can just like ignore this, right? But it seems like this is to me like clearly not the case, right? Elites undermine elections that they lose all the time, right? The whole, I mean, you know, various papers on this panel have like talked about this, right? This was the entire move of, you know, like Donald Trump in the aftermath of the 2020 election, right? We also saw it here in Germany after the most recent election with like in like Sarah Wagenknecht's party, right? So again, the like looking just like going back and addressing some of the like theoretical like motivations regarding incentives as it relates to, you know, who sort of has the who it makes sense to for whom it makes sense to dispute an election. Additionally, right, the like turning like specifically to the issue of the campaign finance, which I do like this is like very interesting. I've not read anything else about this before, so and I do think that this, I mean, like my biggest advice for this paper is to really center the notion is that like this is and this also came through more in the presentation, right? That essentially it's this nuance about who among losers complains, and that it's potentially these people that it relates to the amount that they've like spent on campaigns. But another sort of like minor sort of like framing thing, right, is that you say as that for candidates who incurred a few sunk costs, blaming procedure may be less effective. In some cases, doing so may even be counterproductive and reduce supporters' willingness to invest in future contests. Electoral loss can be blamed on a lack of resources. This is on page 5. It seems to me like basically all of that is also true of candidates that spent more, in the sense of that like it's not clear to me that that sort of like differentiates the candidates who spent less from those who spent more. And so that's potentially also something to go back to. Another thing that occurred to me is, I'm sorry, I didn't note which table this was, but I'm looking at sort of the like winner premium between the like various cases you look at in Africa, right? Is that there's a pretty sizable difference in terms of the extent to which the sort of like high spenders differentiate themselves from the low spenders, right, is different throughout these is pretty like significantly different throughout these cases. And one thing that occurred to me, right, is that could it potentially be that to the extent that these like the evaluations of electoral integrity differ between the like high spenders and low spenders, that there's potentially just like some perceptions related to the fairness of the financing system. Again, I realize that it's with the paper, it's mostly the people that spent more that see it as being as sort of lacking integrity. But in any case, I'm interested whether the like difference in difference between the amount that's been spent is like relevant here. Going to table 4 in the paper, I mean, again, you know, like talk about this a little bit, but the thing that like did really jump out at me is that it's truly the losing candidates are the ones who are significantly more mistrustful than the interaction term that you include, right? I mean, the interaction term is like not significant at like conventional like levels that we sort of like generally look for, right? I was also curious about what it looks what the regressions look like without the interaction term when you potentially like include those factors without the interaction term, because of the way that just including the interaction term inflates the standard errors for all of uh, these variables. And so like moving on to like figure 1, which you included in the presentation, right? That's the one that looks at the perceptions of electoral integrity between winners and losers based on the like z-score of the amount that they spent. In the paper, you say that it rules out an important alternative explanation that high spending constituencies simply tend to have lower quality elections, which to me, I'm curious about. I mean, because like this is not like the actual quality of the election across these constituencies. I apologize if I missed it, but it seems that this is not something that you actually look at directly, right? You're looking at the way that candidates evaluate this, right? Which is not the same thing, right? Like as you've seen in some of these like other papers, right? In that like all of these people have good reasons to be like think about these things in ways that like favor themselves, right? I mean, another way to look at figure 1 is simply showing that like winners and losers both engage in motivated reasoning about electoral quality. I realize in some ways this is a like frustrating like comment to get, right? To the extent that it's like tough to measure differences in like actual electoral quality between subnational districts. But at the same time, you seem to have a lot of or at least a like relatively like large number of like newspaper articles you can draw on. So there's potentially like some ways to at least get at something other than the assessments of the candidates themselves as it relates to this. Before I move on to the second paper here, because I realize I'm taking a lot of time, one is potentially like thinking about the is like specifically like sunk costs the right framing, and that, I mean, again, in a lot of ways this seems like an interesting sort of like extension of the motivated reasoning surrounding winning and losing, because I mean, again, even people like looking at the amount that they spent, right, there's differences, but like everybody involved in the process has sunk costs, right? And then there's also things, like related to like expectations that are like related, like how likely were a lot of these people to win. One thing that occurred to me is like looking at potentially an interaction term between margin and the how much they spent, right? Is that were people that narrowly lost and spent a lot of money potentially more skeptical of the outcome than others. The last thing I'm curious about, right, is that you talk about when you're talking about the results, is that what we see is there's a decline of about 5% of the total value of the variable, but the electoral integrity variable between 0 and 2, given an increase of one standard deviation in terms of campaign spending, which is, I mean, again, that's a little bit hard to interpret, which brought me to sort of like questions about what specifically did you ask candidates about electoral integrity? Because that was one thing that I think that you could also foreground in the paper a little bit more, is sort of helping the reader interpret the dependent variable as it relates to candidates' responses to electoral integrity. Because it's like, as a like variable between 0 and 2, that's, I mean, again, you talk a little bit about it. I believe that like 1 is basically minor problems, 0 is like very little electoral integrity, and 2 is essentially like high electoral integrity. But like there's a lot of wiggle room in terms of that, especially when you're treating it as a continuous variable. And I apologize if I misinterpreted anything about this. But I do want to reiterate that like fundamentally, like while I had some quibbles about or like suggestions regarding the framing, I do think that the heterogeneity among losers is very interesting and something that you should really focus in on, because that is to my reading something that's a new contribution to this particular literature. Okay, so having said that, I'll move on to the paper that's also from on dispute resolution, the institutional experiences with post-election dispute resolution in Malawi. And I think that this one is also very important in that, again, similar to the last one, I agree with the general sentiment that there's been relatively little work done that sort of centers the experiences of the people involved and looks at sort of their perceptions of the fairness of the process, and sort of like other aspects related to this. So that said, one issue with this is that the connections to democratic legitimacy are something that I am sympathetic to and do like generally believe, but you do have to engage with the fact that many, if not most candidates still don't engage with this process at all, right? It seemed like, again, and another thing that could potentially be sort of like made more clear is the extent to which of the sample of candidates who responded to your survey as it relates to the like post-election dispute resolution process, what proportion do they make of the overall pool of one, candidates, and two, candidates that filed disputes? Because that was sort of like not immediately clear from at various times like throughout the paper. But to the extent that you want to connect it to specifically to democratic legitimacy, you do have to engage with the fact of like, what about all of the candidates who didn't see a sufficient problem with the election to like make this an issue, especially in a situation like Malawi's, where it's relatively accessible. There's like no fee. There's sort of a like choice of venue, right, which is like very different than like other systems. I want to cede. I'll cede whatever additional time we have to any Q&A, and I'll just email the rest of my comments to the authors here.